Good morning, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome each and every one of you to our homeland here in Musqueam, where the University of British Columbia is now situated on our home territory in what is now known as Vancouver. But before it was Vancouver, it was the homeland of the Salish people who have been here for over 10,000 years. And so I'd like to welcome each and every one of you and hold my hands up to you for all the work that you're doing and the directions that we're all going to come together in conversation to look at how we can weave our knowledges, our support systems, and our focuses to a place where we no longer have to feel how we feel today in what's going on in our world. I know that it's a big vision, but without a vision, people perish. And we have sometimes come close to that. But because of the women in all of our communities who hold us, who share the knowledges, who give us the strengths that we need, we will accomplish that. I have no doubt, because of people like you who are working so hard in every aspect and area of our communities, that this will be accomplished and it will trickle into the world, and all of us will come to that knowledge. There is a saying in our history and in our culture from our relatives below the border. Our women have said that there will come a time when the earth is parched and the food is being lost, that we all have to come together and rise together and take each other's hands to save this earth that we live on. And I think really that's where we have come to. And I am not living in fear of it, but in faith of it. The faith that we can accomplish this and do this together, because we are not only here as human beings, we're here to connect with our ancestors at all levels and keep them close to us and listen to the knowledge that they will pass back to us in how we do that. And we do that also through our youth, through the youth who are rising today to stand where some of our ancestors stood, where some of our grandparents stood, in standing for what we believe in as brown people, as Black people, as people who have had challenges in this world, that we remind ourselves of our existence through those knowledges. And so I wish you all good words today in your conversations, and that as you discuss, to always remember your ancestors. I think in sharing a very short story with you right now before I leave, I want to share the most powerful movie I feel I ever watched, which was Amistad. And when they were captured off this last ship that came in to New York, and they had to go to court, to Supreme Court, to prove their freedom. And the Supreme Court, one of the lawyers said he wanted to meet with Cinque, who was the head of the group at the time, in a small room to discuss what would go on in the courtroom. The next day, Cinque came in and sat across from the lawyer, and the lawyer said to the interpreter, "Tomorrow we go into court, and there'll be 9 big chiefs who will decide your freedom. And it's going to be tough." And Cinque sat very tall at his seat, and he smiled at the man. And the man said to the interpreter, "Aren't you going to tell him what I said?" And he said, "I did." And he said, "Why is he smiling?" And so he asked Cinque, and Cinque said, He shook his head and he said, "We won't be alone." And the lawyer looked at him and said, "Yes, we will be alone." And he smiled again and he said, "No, we won't be alone, for I shall call back in time, as far back as my ancestors, and I shall call on them to be with us here tomorrow." I was like, oh my God. And the lawyer got a tear in his eye because he had forgotten who he was. And to me, that was so powerful, that we must always remember our connection to who we are and what we're doing. And we must always bring our ancestors with us where we go. And so I want to hold my hands up to all of you today in your conversations. And I would love to meet you all one day and welcome you to this land. And some of you have been here already. And even in this challenging time that we can't be together, this amazing balance of tradition and technology brings us together. And it balances us, and we can be at home and still visit one another and still have these conversations. And so I wish you all good words today, and I will see you again. So Hajka, thank you in my language to all of you. Hold my hands up to you very highly until we meet again. Thank you, Hajka.
Hajka. Thank you, Deborah, for that amazing and powerful welcome. Thank you so much for that. Deborah Sparrow was born and raised on the Musqueam Indian Reserve. She's self-taught in Salish design, weaving, and jewelry making. An acclaimed weaver, Deborah has been deeply involved in the revival of the Musqueam weaving tradition for more than 30 years. Her artwork is exhibited nationally and internationally, including the Museum of Anthropology at UBC, Vancouver International Airport, the Royal BC Museum, the Canadian Museum of History, the Burke Museum in Seattle, and the Smithsonian. In 2008, Deborah received the BC Creative Achievement Award for First Nations art. In 2010, she designed the logo for the Canadian men's hockey team for the 2010 Olympic and the Paralympic Winter Games held in Vancouver, Canada. In 2018, Deborah was instrumental in creating the Blanketing of the City mural series, a part of the Vancouver Mural Festival. For it, she created 3 giant murals that showcase Musqueam weaving patterns and acknowledge the visual culture of the people whose unceded territory we're on. Deborah continues to create from her home in Musqueam. She's also a teacher, having taught Salish weaving to hundreds of people of all ages. And she continues to educate others about the history and culture, beauty, and integrity of her people through her work, activism, and speaking engagements. So again, thank you, Deborah. This series today, this topic in the underrepresentation in the academy, we are focusing on Black women in STEM, and we have 2 amazing speakers with us today. I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping before we get started. So first, this session is being recorded, and there's auto transcript is enabled, so closed captioning. We do have ASL interpreters that will be on the screen, and they will switch out, so don't be alarmed if you see a different face, and they're here to help. And then we'll have a Q&A feature that is active in the webinar session that you can pose your question, and feel free to do that at any time throughout the seminar, and then we'll get to them during the Q&A session. And with that, I wanted to introduce our first speaker. So Professor Madian Andrade is president of the Canadian Black Scientists Network, of which I'm a member, yay. Special advisor to the Dean on Inclusive Recruitment and Equity Education, and a biologist at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. With a PhD in neurobiology and behavior from Cornell University, her fundamental research examines the evolution of behavior and species diversity. Andrade serves as the Vice Dean, Faculty Affairs, Equity and Success from 2017 to 2020, was a Canadian Research Chair from 2007 to 2018, and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As founder of an inaugural co-chair of the Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence, known as TIDE, she has established a group of faculty knowledge translator who initiate conversation about equity and inclusion across the University of Toronto. She was awarded the 2019 Ludwig and Estelle Just Memorial Human Rights Prize by the University of Toronto's Alumni Association in recognition of the impact of this work. And so with that, I want to thank you, Dr. Mary-Ann Andrade, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, very generous introduction. And also thank you, Deborah, for that welcome. It was lovely. So as you heard, I'm a biologist, but I have spent the last 10 years immersed in the social science literature on equity and inclusion, in addition to my primary research in biology. And I didn't choose this work, it chose me, partly because of the diagram you see here. I spent 15 years post-secondary training to become a fundamental researcher. And during that time, I had one woman professor. During that time, I had no Black professors. That includes time in Vancouver, in Toronto, and in New York State. It was something that after a while you can't help but notice. I started out going occasionally to sessions like this one at conferences, and frequently what I would hear about is the experiences of people like me in the academy who found themselves to be the lonely only, as we call it sometimes, in departments, at conferences, in other spaces in the academy, and especially in STEM. What I didn't realize at the time is that there's a lot of data underlying those patterns that might help us think of a way to redress them. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, although I'm also going to tell you a bit about my own anecdotal experiences, given that I now know that they are actually very common. So these are data from Universities Canada survey in 2019 that show you the representation of people as faculty, PhD holders, undergraduates, and the general population in Canada. I here show you women, Black people, and people so-called visible minorities because of the subject of this particular set of talks. And so what you can see here is that largely through very proactive means over the last couple of decades, the proportion of women who are faculty in orange are now very close to the proportion of PhD holders in Canada, although we are still much less than the proportion of undergraduates who identify as women and in the population as a whole. So we still have some room to make with respect to women and the representation in the academy. For visible minorities, what you see is a steady decrease as you go from undergraduates through PhD holders to faculty representation, although the proportion of faculty do reflect what we see in Canadian population as a whole for people who identify as visible minorities. If you then disaggregate the data so you can see people who identify as Black, what you can see is that the proportion of, again, individuals who are faculty are less than the proportion of Black people who have PhDs, and a bit less than the proportion of the population as a whole, and many less than what we see among undergraduates. So there are issues here with representation. And these numbers, even though partially disaggregated, do hide a lot of variation. So among women, for example, we know that even though the proportion of women faculty are comparable to PhD holders, that hides a lot of variation because in fields like applied sciences and actually even life sciences, women are underrepresented relative to this number, whereas in fields like, for example, nursing and social work, they are at much higher percentages. The same is true for so-called visible minorities. If you look in a disaggregated way at the data, as you do here for Black people on the right, and I'll point out the axes are quite different here, you don't necessarily see where all this variation lies. And from my experience in Canada and from the data that we have, a lot of Black faculty in Canada are in fact in the social sciences, much less so in STEM disciplines. And just to give you an example, an anecdote that aligns with that, I was asked to participate in a study in which they looked at how people who taught evolution dealt with students who came in with various types of ideas based on their religious background. And when they published that study, which was supposed to anonymize all of the accounts, they identified some comments that were made by Jane, a Black Canadian professor who teaches evolution. That's me, a Black Canadian professor who teaches evolution. I was the only one in Canada at the time the paper was published. I think I may still be. So that tells you just how underrepresented we are in the sciences. Now, another way of looking at representation is to ask about who are we missing among faculty. And these are some data from Melinda Smith, who I believe has been to UBC to speak in the past. And this shows you the unemployment rate for people who identify as university professors or lecturers, so presumably are qualified to do those jobs, but are unemployed in those professions. This is the proportion of people who identify as white men and women on average who are unemployed and identify that way. And this shows you the disaggregated data for people who identify in other groups, including Indigenous men and women and different racialized groups of men and women. And you can see here that there are pools of individuals who are not being employed in this way, in the same way as we see for white men and women. I also want to point out that this graph shows you, gives you beginnings of a bit of a taste of intersectionality. That is the idea that there are unique aspects to people's identities that are not represented on the single axis, and that understanding those uniquenesses can actually help us understand where the barriers are. So here, for example, programs that increase the representation of women in the academy, which have been in place for 10 or 20 years, have had a positive effect on white women, but much less so for women of other racialized identities and for Indigenous women. And in fact, if we look at moving through the academy, who ends up in senior leadership, these data are also from Universities Canada. And it shows you that for senior leaders, again, those programs that have been in place for years have resulted in an increase in the proportion of women in senior leadership. If I showed you these data from 20 years ago, they look quite different, but in fact have not touched in any substantive way leadership roles for people who identify as visible minorities or for people who identify as Black. So there is underrepresentation both in terms of total presence in the academy, in terms of leadership, and as I alluded to, but I actually don't have good data for yet, these patterns can be even more accentuated in fields like STEM. Now, I'm just sort of tossing around the idea of racialized, and I think it's important here to identify what race is and what race isn't, and also talk about what we mean when we say racism and what we say when we mean underrepresentation and bias. So what is race? Race is a concept that we use to group people that share a certain set of visible characteristics, such as skin color, such as hair, such as facial features. And the Human Genome Project has shown us that these visible characteristics are influenced by genes. And some of those genes let us track, for example, the recency of certain ancestral backgrounds. But what the Human Genome Project has also shown us very clearly is that the vast majority of genetic variation does not track with what we call race. That is, there's as much variation within a so-called race as there is between races. A person who has Black skin like I do, who's listening to my talk, I'm no more likely to have genetic capacities in common with that person as I am a white person listening to my talk, right? So outside of the visible characteristics, the genome does not track with race. And yet race is real. Race is socially constructed, and we can look at things that correlate with race. But we need to keep in mind, even though we see these correlations, that genes that underlie things like capacity, interest, preferences, and ability do not correlate with race. That means that these other things we see, like social disadvantage, like underrepresentation in the academy, like the belief that certain people are less able to do certain types of research, those kinds of beliefs are based on stereotype, are based on bias, and are based on structural racism. They're not based in reality on any biological reality to the concept of race. In Canada, racism is a problem and anti-Black racism is a problem. If you look through the literature, I could show you 20, 30 studies that show you some of the data on this, everything from policing right through to how you assess your colleagues when you're looking at a CV. I don't have time to do that today, and I'm just going to encourage you to take a look if you doubt that these things are real. The UN has identified anti-Black racism as a problem in Canada, right? And there have been a variety over the last couple of years in particular of reports talking about the fact that racism and anti-Black racism is a problem in science in particular. This last study is my favorite. Does STEM stand out? Examining racial and ethnic gaps in the persistence across post-secondary fields. And I'll tell you the answer is yes, STEM stands out. So STEM in particular has this problem. Perhaps because, as they've shown in other studies, people tend to think of science, technology, engineering, and math as things that require brilliance right out of the box, right? You either got it or you haven't. And we have good evidence that people are less likely to think that racialized people, that Black people in particular, are brilliant right out of the box in anything other than sports. So race is not a biological reality, it's a social construct. So what is racism and what is structural racism? Well, I think in the past we used to talk about racism in terms of what I would now call, and most groups would now call, racial prejudice, people who study this. So racial prejudice is a set of discriminatory attitudes based on assumptions and perceptions about race or skin color, right? So visible characteristics like I discussed. And racial prejudice can point in any direction. So you could have a prejudice against white people, against Black people, against Indian people, against Asian people. But to think about structural racism, we need to invoke something else. And that is, we need to understand who in society has the power to create structures that give an advantage to one race over another. Power is the authority granted through social structures and conventions, and they do align with racial prejudices because they were created at a time when racial prejudice was actually the expectation. So structural or systematic racism is when racial prejudice and power are both present. So unlike racial prejudice alone, which can point in any direction, structural or systematic racism points in only one direction, from those in power to those who do not have power. And that's why we talk about anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Asian racism in a society in which the statistically dominant group is white. This means a few things that I want to touch on. First of all, reverse racism is not a meaningful concept. And in fact, the Human Rights Code recognizes this, right? Programs to redress racialized disadvantage, structural racism, are supported by the BC Human Rights Code and the other human rights codes across the different provinces, right? They're called special programs. Second, racism is societal, it's systematized, it's sustained, it's built into our institutions. That means that it outlives any one individual. It outlives any one individual. But at an individual level, bias and prejudice are supported by and reinforced by those societal structures, and individual actions and biases can subvert even equitable policies and processes. This means that both individual and structural changes are required if we're going to see inclusive outcomes, right? So both of those things have to happen. And that's why I like to point that out early on, because more and more as this debate about or discussion about racism and anti-Black racism becomes more common, I keep hearing this phrase as a dichotomy. Some people say we need to focus on structural programs, and talking about bias, individual bias, is a cop-out. Some people say we need to focus on the individual actors, and until the actors change, structural change will have no effect. The truth is we have to do both, and we have to do them in concert. So how do we know there's systematic racism against Black people in the academy in general, in society in general, and how does that affect STEM? Again, I don't always have specific data for STEM, but sometimes I do. But I want to start in high schools. In this case, it's a general understanding of how anti-Black racism can work. These are data from the TDSB, not just because I'm in Toronto, but because it is the biggest school district in Canada. And it's one in which Carl James, a professor at York, was able to acquire data to ask about systematic racism. And what he focused on was the flow of students into courses that allow them to continue to university, right? So those required courses in high school that you need in order to apply to university. Now, even though he looked at those in toto, We know that STEM fields in university have many more requirements in terms of things you had to do in high school than do other fields. So I think these are very relevant for STEM. And what he found was this. This graph shows you the proportion of students in what are called essential or locally developed courses for people with learning disabilities. In applied streams, these are streams in which the courses do not allow you to apply directly to university. And in academic streams, courses that do allow you to apply directly to university. What you can see here is that Black students are different from white students and are different from other racialized students, and that the proportion of those students in applied courses is much higher than those other two groups. These are students who then would have to go through a lot of extra steps, summer school, night school, in order to upgrade their credentials to get into university. So maybe they just aren't doing as well as those other students. Well, he paired these with qualitative data collection from families in the TDSB, a large number of them, and this is typical of the things that you heard. Throughout the consultations, participants shared stories of students who had B averages in grade 8, and were told, you'll get A's if you go to the applied courses in high school. These are from their counselors or from their teachers. Some students with A averages in grade 8 were told that high school would be much harder if they took academic courses, and on that basis, they were encouraged to take applied courses to maintain their A average and shut the door to university. This is happening in such a systematic way that the province is once again talking about changing the way in which students are streamed into these courses. More recently, for people who get into the STEM fields, who get into the academy, who are then professors, your livelihood depends, whether or not you get tenure depends on whether or not you get grants and whether or not you publish your research. The Tri-Council granting agencies have just started collecting data on this. And what you can see here, or we'll see in a minute, are data that were just released by the CIHR, who are just starting to collect data on racialized status and then make it public with respect to granting success. So what you're going to see is the success rate percentage-wise for the 2018 and 2019 competitions in CIHR for grants, in which people in green identified as visible minorities, or in blue identified as not visible minorities, and they were either early career researchers, ECR, or not. And what you can see systematically here is that people who identify as visible minorities have a lower granting success rate across the board in CIHR. We don't know why yet, but we do have comparable data from the United States where they do know why and where they collect more data. And in the United States, this racialized gap in success rate has been the case for decades. This is outliving any one individual, right? This is systematic. This is something about the structure that results in disadvantage for people who identify as minorities. And a follow-up study on this from 2011 looked in more detail at these results and actually created models to ask about what explained this difference in success rate. These models control for educational background, country of origin, training, previous research awards, publication record, and employer characteristics, and nevertheless show a 10% deficit for people who identify as Black relative to people who identify as white and in these other groups, and a 4% deficit for people who identify as Asian in granting success rate, despite controlling for all these factors. Is this what our data are going to look like in Canada? We don't know yet. We don't know yet. Are these what data look like for NSERC as well as CIHR? We don't know yet. I hope we will soon. But structure is not the only problem. There are also issues with individual actions and with the expression of bias, even unconscious biases that nevertheless can influence how people interact. And these are equally important as the structures, in my opinion. So if you think about diversity and inclusion, that is the construction of a representative faculty where everyone has the ability to achieve according to their talents and their interests. What you think about is people being attracted into an institution by its reputation, its programs, and its resources, right? We recruit them, and then we try to retain them, we promote them, and we hope for their success so they bring their innovative skill to the table. But it's not just the university reputation that allows this progression. It is the culture of the group into which they're moving. The faculty and campus, the unit that they're moving into, the department, all of this will affect whether or not recruitment is successful in the first place, and then once someone's recruited, whether they're retained and promoted. How do we know how to ensure that we build a pipeline? I hate the word pipeline, that we ensure that flow through is representative and fair in STEM as in other fields. We have lots and lots of data and reports on this. And one example I want to highlight for you is a 2008 study from a group called the Education Advisory Board. They actually reviewed metrics of success for building a diverse, inclusive faculty, looking at best practices across 150 different universities. What they found was wide success in recruiting and retaining diverse faculty. And it wasn't correlated with how much money those universities had. People often say, well, I don't have the resources to recruit people. No, what they actually found was that you could predict a lot of the differences based on effort, institutional efforts at being a good place for people to come to and a place where recruitment was successful. They also made the point that diversity initiatives that were created in central offices often fail to penetrate through to those making the decisions. That is the faculty, the rank and file, who are actually making the decisions, who are actually sitting on those committees, and who are interacting with each other every day. So what is needed, according to this report, according to everything else that we see in the literature, is again, structural changes and faculty education and changes on the individual level. And I just want to point out that this is very basic change management, right? This is how you would approach anything. You convince people that a change needs to be made. You make the changes. You educate people on how those changes can be implemented in a fair way that will lead to your objectives. Now, why is individual effort important? Because these people you are trying to recruit are not only being assessed by committees of their peers, they're also landing in a culture that is built by their peers. And I want to share with you here some anecdotes from my own professional life. I show this iceberg slide because there's certain things below the water, and what's below the water is much more than what I'm going to share with you from above the water. And even though I'm in an institution that I love, with colleagues that I value in a great department, my experiences, the ones I'm going to share with you, the ones that are just a little bit above the waterline, have been such that depending on the supports you have behind you, it may filter you out of these streams. And so I'm just going to share some of these with you. From very early on, are you sure you want to be a professor? Have you ever considered being a teacher? Nothing wrong with being a teacher, but that's not what I wanted to do. Can you type up my NSERC application? Can you take notes at the meeting? Can you arrange the meeting time? Can you send us a reminder by email? You're getting married. Does that have any reproductive implications? These are all in professional contexts. Oh, you're the woman hire. Okay, so now we have our token woman on the short list, one of my first search committees. Will you women please make up your mind in a faculty meeting? It was a great meeting, except that guy didn't hear a word you said after an administrative meeting with reference to the provost representative on that committee. Maternity leave is a great time for you to write some papers. You really remind me of fill in the name of any other Black woman and multiply that by 10. Is that your real hair? Most of our students are immigrant. They're just not interested in evolution. Keep in mind that I'm an evolutionary biologist and I'm an immigrant, and this is what I was told when I was proposing a course. My Black students just don't work as hard. They're only interested in socializing. In the old days, the only way we could access porn was to get National Geographic and flip to the pages of the naked African women. This during lunch with my colleagues. And my personal favorite, after I was accidentally copied on an email that satirized, racialized, and sexualized my research, that was accidentally sent to the entire department in the week prior to my job interview, the response from the chair was this: please don't mention it to him. It was just a joke, and he is really embarrassed. And then I showed up the next week and gave my job talk to that same group of people. So the point here is I made it. It doesn't mean I haven't experienced these things. And it doesn't mean that if you're in a room with people and you feel like that room has a particular type of culture, That isn't necessarily the culture that they're experiencing. Now, that isn't to say that the other person in this relay race, which is a person from the statistically dominant group, that isn't to say that they aren't experiencing challenges in their career. They, of course, are experiencing challenges. Tenure is hard to get. It's hard to balance home and work life. The point is that people in particular groups, women, people of color, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, Black women in STEM fields where they may be the only one they've ever met, they have a variety of challenges that may be unseen to others that are both structural and based on culture that they have to overcome to make it to the end. Denying that those things are there just makes it that much less likely that they're going to make it to the end of that race. Now, luckily, we know what to do about these things. I kind of alluded to it already. We need to make progress on multiple fronts. If you want to look up the work of any of these groups, you'll get lots of ideas about what we could do. The Educational Advisory Board report is particularly instructive. And the thing is, we do know what to do, because it's the same thing you would do if I were to say to you, you aren't enrolling enough students, you need to increase the proportion of students from this country or that country. You would collect disaggregated data about what you needed to understand. You'd identify quantitative targets for what you want to change. You would develop programs to address the areas of concern, educate and inspire the decision makers and the people who are actually going to be doing the work on the ground. You would incentivize the targets you've made, and then you'd go back and see how you're doing. It's exactly what we need to do with respect to increasing the proportion of people in the academy who look like the people you see when you're walking down the sidewalk in Canada. Now, I want to give you a feel for how we've been doing this at University of Toronto Scarborough. That was one of the reasons why I took on the position of vice dean, because I was told, and it was true, that my dean, my provost, my principal were all in favor of making changes. So we've created incentives and programs, including faculty allocation processes that require explicit consideration of EDI for every position. Not just EDI in terms of the representation of the person you're looking for, but what has your unit done to make sure you're inclusive regardless of who you recruit. We've established Dean's discretion pathways for inclusive excellence hires. These are in addition to routine allocations. So you can apply for one of these as a new faculty line and say, there's this particular area and we're aware of a scholar who's Black or Indigenous who we'd like to recruit. Or in the course of another search, you can say, I've identified a candidate who fits inclusive excellence criteria. Can we make 2 hires out of this search? To make sure that when people get to the campus, that they are welcomed, that they're included, we've rebuilt and bolstered our mentorship and cohort building programs. And then the other thing that I've been doing, not as part of the vice dean role, but sort of on the side, you heard about a bit, and that is through the TIDE program, is facilitating that education and incentivizing the desire to make a change. So we have now search committees for all chairs and vice deans on our campus have to do a 20-minute session at the beginning of the very first search committee meeting on unconscious bias and how it manifests in searches. And for that, kudos to our dean. We've integrated this into our boot camp and yearly retreat for chairs and directors. Assessors on committees are recommended to these kinds of sessions as well. We have a regular seminar series. And then the TIDE group that I co-founded leads talks and workshops on request. And I just want to point this out because this is something that I think more institutions in Canada could use. Ours is currently based on volunteer work, but it is one of the strong recommendations of the Educational Advisory Board that the most effective way to motivate faculty to action is to use data-driven presentations that are led by respected colleagues. That is not some group that you hire from the outside that comes in, but they're colleagues who've immersed themselves as knowledge translators. That has basically been our approach with TIDE. And in the last 2 years, we've actually engaged with 60 different units on this kind of education effort. And these are bespoke conversations with those units about their particular challenges, data from their particular field. The other thing we've done outside of that, together with colleagues, is to create the Canadian Black Scientist Network. As Paula said, she's a member of this. And this really is because of that image I showed you at the beginning of being the lonely only. I value my white colleagues. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else other than where I am now. But sometimes you don't want to have to explain the barriers that you're facing as you move forward. You just want to talk about them. You just want support. And sometimes when people say to you, there are no Black scientists to hire in this particular role, you want to be able to say, have a look at our website. And that's some of the things that we are doing. I also want to point out that there's a variety of different ways you can engage with us online. Please do reach out. Please, if you know a Black scientist in Canada or a Canadian Black scientist who is living abroad, encourage them to reach out and join us. One of the things we're going to be doing that you'll be hearing a lot more about is having a national conference in mid-November, at which you can meet some of these people on the Canadian landscape, but also in which we are going to discuss how to make sure that what we know about how to make change can begin to be implemented across the Canadian landscape. So with that, I think I will stop and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for that exciting talk. And we'll definitely circle back around in the Q&A to ask some questions, some follow-up questions. I want to take this time to introduce our second speaker. So Dr. Natasha, known as Dr. Tasha Anderson, is a mechanical engineer turned award-winning STEM educator and STEM advocate, STEM leadership consultant, and a dynamic and informative in-demand STEM innovation speaker, podcast host, and author. Dr. Tasha offers intensive professional and leadership development coaching and training for STEM entities, educators, and school system staff, and mentoring for young minority women and girls in STEM. She also offers STEM keynote motivational speaking services to organizations, associations, corporations, conferences, and educational systems nationwide. Currently, Dr. Tasha is a VP of Implementation and Training for WazEd a STEM education company that specializes in customized science and STEM kits and curriculum. In her spare time, Dr. Anderson can be found reading a good romance novel or binge watching Netflix shows, as many of us probably are in COVID. She is a wife of 21 years and is a mother to one, who's a college sophomore and one high school junior. So she's a mother of 21 years and is a mother to one college sophomore and a high school junior. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Natasha. Welcome and thank you.
Whew. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. I am really excited and grateful to be here. Dr. Andretti, that talk was amazing. The data that you provided for me and for us, it was so needed. And it paints the picture and the idea. It gives people a visual representation of what is really happening in the field. And it's exactly what we need, especially if we're going to address the challenges moving forward. So we need data to back up our decision makings and our thoughts, especially if we were going to do the very thing that you talked about during your talk, and that involves changing mindsets, changing systems, and those such things. So, and it leads right into what I want to discuss with you all today. So the question of the day, the question of the hour is, where are all the Black women in STEM, right? So we know what the problem, Dr. Andretti, she laid them out there for us. This is an issue that has been talked about across North America, and it is indeed a global issue. And even though this has been a known issue for a period of time, it is only until recently, and by recently, I mean within the past 5 to 7 years, that there has been a more concerted effort to address real and or perceived issues around the dearth of women in STEM and the dearth of women and racialized women in STEM in particular. So why is this important? Like, why are we talking about this? Why is this a particular conversation that we are having now and we need to continue to have in the future? It's important because as the world population grows older and the population within STEM grows older and business and industries go bigger and bigger, we know straight up that we're going to need more people. It really is a numbers issue. So instead of us saying, hey, I can't find people to fulfill these jobs, the thought needs to be, as Dr. Andretti has already said, where are you looking? We're here, we're out here. Her and I are evidence, and Paula are all evident that we exist. Black women in STEM, we're here, and we're willing and able, and we want to be able to use the skills that we have dedicated our lives to in the field. So we know that it is unrealistic to assume or to believe that all of these jobs that are out there are available are going to be filled by white people. It assumes facts that are not in evidence at the moment. I want to spend my time specifically talking about the issues that Black women are facing in corporations and institutions in STEM. Black women, we know, are woefully underrepresented in STEM. And even in 1994, Kat Samba stated that when compared with other subgroups, women of color are significantly absent in STEM professions. Unfortunately, few researchers at the time were studying how the dual presence of race and gender affect the educational experiences and the professional experiences of Black women. Rather, the issue of race and gender is often addressed in isolation. Seldom are these two features and their simultaneous effects thoroughly explored through empirical research so that certain truths may be revealed about the Black woman experience. However, I want to make clear that Black women's participation in STEM is key and vital for innovation and for solving global economic and societal issues, even though we are still dramatically underrepresented in the field. In the US, which is where I am, only 2.9% of Black women completed a degree in STEM. In the workplace, we experience dual biases of our work environments. And this is across the board, whether we are talking about corporations, business industry, or in academia. Scientific American discovered that 45% of women in STEM leave their jobs because they feel underpaid and underrepresented. The result is fewer Black women in booming, high-paying industry, fewer role models to inspire the next generation, and fewer brilliant minds working to solve world-scale challenges. One big factor in this is called the broken rung at the first critical step up to manager. This means that there are fewer Black women to promote at every subsequent level, and the representation gaps keep getting wider. When a Black woman succeeds, people often contribute her accomplishment to factors that are outside of her control, such as affirmative action, such as help from others, random choices. She had help from outside, just anything other than she knocked it out of the park. Her gifts, talents, and abilities spoke, and it spoke loudly in this situation. For example, colleagues might say things like, she got the promotion because she's Black. All right, you guys have, maybe if you're a Black woman on here who has had that experience, just raise your hand and acknowledge that that's happened to you. Or she was lucky to close that sale. She was lucky that she got that project, or she was lucky that she had a great team behind her. This reinforces a damaging stereotype that portrays Black women as less talented and competent than their peers. When these comments go unchallenged, they can prevent Black women from receiving the credit they deserve for their hard work and their achievements. Women of color, and Black women in particular, tend to receive less support and encouragements from their managers. Compared to white women, Black women are less likely to have managers that showcase their work, advocate for new opportunities for them, or give them opportunities to manage people and projects. Black women are also less likely to report that their manager helps them navigate organizational politics. I can attest to this one, or balance work and personal life. This matters, Employees who have consistent manager support are more likely to be promoted, and they're more likely to believe that they have an equal opportunity for advancement. So let's talk about microaggressions. So I don't know about you, but I've been hearing more about microaggressions in the past couple of years than I've ever heard before. I think I'm really safe in saying that I've known about microaggressions for quite a long time, but let's talk about what they are and what effects they have on a Black woman in the workplace. So microaggressions, these are comments and actions that subtly demean or dismiss someone based on their gender, race, or other aspect of their identity. And they are a common experience for Black women at work. And since Black women face both racism and sexism, they experience a wider range of microaggression than women overall. They are more likely to have their judgment questioned in their area of expertise and to be asked to provide additional evidence of their competence. They are also nearly two and a half times more likely than white women, and more than 3 times more likely than men to hear someone in their workplace express surprise about their language skills and other abilities. Now, I can tell you I've had microaggressions galore that have happened to me. The one that always stands out to me is the one time I was speaking with a colleague, and this is when I was a professor at a university. She'd never met me face to face. We'd only had phone conversations, and I think she only knew me as Dr. Anderson. So we meet in person for the first time, and the first thing she says to me is, "Your people must be proud." And I was floored as to what she could possibly have meant. And when I challenged her on it, it changed the whole course of the conversation. But at the same time, it threw me off because I'm like, she can't mean what I think she means, right? But it's those little incidences there that affect us. It's like a little dagger every time those things happen. So microaggressions may seem insignificant when viewed as isolated incidences, but when they occur day after day after day, and they often do, their impact builds up and takes a toll. Whether intentional or unintentional, these insults and invalidations signal disrespect. It's hard for any employee to bring their best self to work when they're often underestimated and slighted at every turn. Women who experience microaggressions are 3 times more likely to regularly think about leaving their jobs than those who don't. And so this next thing I'm going to talk about is really, this has been my experience. And it's called being the first and only, or the only, right? We have this experience that I call the only and the other, only, first, and other. And as in we are the only Black person, one of the only Black people in the room at work, or we are the only woman, and we're the only Black person, and we're the only woman. So we're dealing with 2 different things at the same time. So in my experience is that this is an exceedingly difficult experience and situation to be placed in. We are aware of the fact that we are seen as a representative of our race and as our gender. And we are more likely than other racial and ethnic groups to feel as though our successes, individual successes and failures, will be a reflection on all of us. So there's really no individual successes and or failures. We know that when we fail, it's going to be thought of as, well, that's what Black people do. And then when we succeed, it goes either way with what the thought is going to be for our race in general. So this leads to a sense that we are constantly under scrutiny. Black women often report feeling closely watched, on guard, or under increased pressure to perform. While the majority of white women and men say they see themselves as allies, and this is really important. So white people in general see themselves as allies to us at work and in institutions. But please note that we often don't feel the same way. We often feel that we are not supported by our colleagues, our friends, or our bosses at work. We need more than mentorship. Yes to mentorships. Let me just be clear. We still need it. Mentorship, being able to say, hey, this is how you succeed in this role. These are some of my experience. Here's how I navigated these tough spaces. Yes. But we also need what I call sponsorship. This goes beyond good advice and sympathizing. White employees hold most of the power in corporate America and in institutions of higher learning. What sponsorship means is that you are speaking about me positively in rooms and spaces that I am not in. It means that you are being a great ally and saying that you are calling out racism, you are calling out discrimination, you are calling out prejudice in those same spaces. So challenging racism is a basic act of allyship. And even though most employees believe that they are allies, only 40% in general have ever spoken out against racism at work. Let that sink in. In academia, in addition to feeling marginalized, Black women often feel unprecedented self-doubt, a lack of confidence in one's abilities, and challenges related to dealing with stereotype threat and imposter syndrome as instigated by on-campus interactions. These experiences often cause Black women to seek refuge and find and/or create a community that reflects their identity, that understands their language, that allows them to speak candidly about racial encounters they have faced almost on a daily basis. In academia, it is my belief that we will not see more Black women in STEM fields until the fundamental changes are made in how we educate and train students, and in the ways in which we mentor and support all faculty, not just Black women faculty who might be the only faculty member or woman of color, but all faculty members, so that the climate these women step into is not just supportive, but is indeed anti-racist. The same thing goes for leadership up the chain to the university presidents and all major vice president, vice provosts, and the like. It has to be all in. It has to be all in. So this work is ongoing and there is so much more work to do. So what are some solutions? We've laid out the problems. I'm sure some of you are tired of hearing about the problems, but we do have some solutions. All right, so we know that the research supports the idea that EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion is here to stay. It's here to stay, y'all. It's always been important, but it's now part of a much bigger conversation that includes company or institutional health and wealth. Forbes says cultivating a diverse employee population where everybody feels able to bring their best selves to work is not only the right thing to do, but it is also better for business. Fast Company says organizations with above average gender diversity and levels of employee engagement outperform companies with below average diversity and engagement by 58%. The UBC Inclusion Action Plan states that the emerging research is unequivocal. Diversity enhances innovation, and inclusive spaces are required to ensure that diverse teams are able to collaborate effectively. As the world continues more connected, and UBC focuses on contributing to global citizenship and finding solutions to complex issues. This plan supports our continuing progress. It supports our commitments to reconciliation and recognition of our locations on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of Indigenous people. This history and relationship in these lands frames our efforts to understand decolonization in the context of all of our inclusion efforts. Us doing these things, EDI, are the conditions for attracting and retaining the best and brightest students, faculty, and staff from around the world. So you guys get it. And after having reviewed the UBC action plan, I will say that it is very comprehensive and thorough. I believe that ultimately the key to success of the plan are: 1, governance; 2, getting buy-in at every single level of the pipeline; 3, you guys must adopt at all levels of said pipeline an attitude of continuous improvement; 4, you must have a system, a dedicated system for checks and balances; and 5, get the help you need to advance the cause when you need it. So let's talk a little bit about governance, because I think that this is really important, and this is where we need to start. Governance is a system of rules or practices and processes by which an organization is directed and or controlled. It ensures effective management of the interests of the organization's internal and external stakeholders, especially when driving these types of programs. It focuses on students, partners, clients, the community. To create meaningful change, the support has to be system-wide, and it must be demonstrated at every single level. I think that UBC has done that. From what I can see, you have leaders in place, you have metrics identified, and you have data systems in place from what I can tell. So great job. But as the decisions maker must be intentional about the diversity efforts. You've got to put money, you got to put the numbers, the time, and the energy behind them. Make sure that every single person employed, included in those longstanding and tenured folks, know that this is what we're doing now, and provide them with training and opportunities for growth. Because you guys know, if we're being truthful and honest, it's going to take some people a longer time to get used to the new normal, right? This is the way we're doing things now. This is the way we did it like that before. We're not doing that now. This is what it needs to look like, and then give them the opportunity to grow. And then if not, then you need to make some other decisions. Okay, systems review is a must. We have to know that the systems we have in place work for everyone. We have to do a fair assessment of what's currently in place and acknowledge what they were and what they have been. All right, so now is the time for us to be intentional about dismantling those systems so that Black and Brown and other racialized groups are given fair consideration and choices. Recruitment and retention strategies that consider the benefits to all students, but also rights the wrongs in the current retention and recruitment efforts. Yes, we need this plan. You can't have one without the other. You must be intentional about recruiting minority and underrepresented students, and you must be intentional about retaining them also. As Black women in academia attempt to independently combat their dual oppression, and as they are tokenized in spaces where they're the only person who looks like them, institutions should work to make spaces, allot money, personnel, and resources to create programs designed to reduce the unique challenges that these students face in the academy. Create a culture of inclusion that creates spaces for all employees to contribute. Positions EDI as the responsibility of everyone in the organization. They should take both gender and race into account when setting representation targets, provide mentoring, sponsorship, and professional development opportunities, share key metrics with employees, and do more to foster a sense of organization-wide accountability, and award progress by incorporating diversity targets into senior leaders' performance evaluation and reviews. The simple fact is that we need more Black women in STEM. We need more Black and racialized women in our workspaces and institutions. The contribution that these women have already made have already proven to be invaluable. We as a country, as a continent, would not be as advanced as we are without them. Let's treasure and value the Black women in STEM who've silently withstood racism, sexism, and probably all of the isms. They are important to us, they are important to me, and they should be important to you. I stand on their shoulders, and I in particular want them to be proud of me and the work that I'm doing. Where are all the Black women in STEM? That's the question on the table. I'd say that they're right here doing the work. I say that they're in development, looking for opportunities. I'd say that they are right now being encouraged by parents and guardians to continue down this pathway. It is now our job to provide these women with good, solid, safe, budgeted, supported opportunities to make the difference that I already know that they can and they will. Diversity is what we are. Inclusion is an act. Belonging speaks to not only having a space at the table, being a part of the environment, but also that environment is one you have ownership in and you are invited to co-create in. And that was said by Rosanna Duworthy, who is LinkedIn's head of global diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Thank you for your time today. And I hope that you had some really key takeaways from there.
Ooh, wow. Thank you both, Dr. Natasha and Madianne, for such really exciting thoughts. And thank you so much for all of the action items that we can take part of and do at UBC. We definitely have some work cut out for us, and I'm definitely glad that you spoke to the strategy that we already have here, but also how we can make it more effective. So we do have some time for questioning, and I'm just going to go right to the questions and save mine for later because I can reach out to you in my personal time and get my questions answered. So the first question, and thank you all for submitting your questions in the chat. Please continue to do so, and we'll get through as many of them as possible as we can. And so there was a question that came in, some thank yous for the wonderful talk. And the question was, any thoughts on the potential for anachronistic hierarchical structure titles and related skewed power dynamics in academia on perpetuating underrepresented representation along the pipeline through faculty? So it's a two-part question. That's the first part. And wonder to what extent that explorative practices that are normalized in academic training contribute to the drop-off of among underrepresented advanced postdoctoral scholars before jumping onto the faculty role. So basically, what kind of practices are in place that are causing people who are postdocs are kind of dropping off, and what are these hierarchical titles that we have, and how is that playing a role?
So I would say, one, this goes back to what I was saying in my earlier talk, was like you really have to do a deep dive of the systems that you currently have in place. You have to do this work. It's one thing for you to have a nice plan in place and say, we're going to do these things. But if you aren't doing that in conjunction with doing the deep dive into the systems to see what's broken and where it's broken, then it's sort of like putting a nice cover on the thing. So you have to do those, and then you have to be able and be willing to identify those problem areas, and sometimes the problem folks.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that several institutions are approaching this problem now by having postdoctoral fellowships that are specifically designed for people of color, for Black people in particular. A few institutions in Canada are doing that now. And the point of that is that you come with your own money. So when you come with your own money and with your own research funds, you have a different place at the table than if you are dependent on the grant of someone else. And while everyone might like to be in that position, if you also have this, as Dr. Tasha said, this double bind of being a Black woman who's suffering these other challenges elsewhere, it's particularly important that, at least with respect to your research agenda, you have some power. And so that's one thing that institutions can do, even as they're thinking about maybe a more fundamental shift in how you think about postdoctoral fellowships. Some institutions also have unionized their postdocs. I'm still not sure how I feel about that myself, because I think it shifts the focus of what that time is. But that does provide protections for some people that I think are necessary, because if you get a bad actor as a supervisor, it can be devastating.
Thank you. The next question is, the point regarding having respective colleagues share the data-driven findings resonates with this person. However, in their department, it seems like women and other minorities are doing all the work of EDI knowledge translation. How can we motivate the men in our department to realize that they have work to do too? And our senior faculty, who are also mostly men, were very frustrated with their lack of motivation and action.
Yeah, this is right. I mean, this is where we find ourselves. So I think this goes back to the plan of action, where we're saying it has to be, everybody has to be all in on this, or it's not going to work. I mean, and I think that's a true statement. And so that goes back to the other part of me saying, hey, we have to give training. Here's what it looks like. Here's the work that everyone is required to do. And then, of course, give them the opportunity to do or not to do. And then there are other decisions that need to be made at that point.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that is the critical place where leadership, this is a call to leadership. And the leadership is to say, you're a senior member of this department, you're expected to do a certain amount of service. Some of that service needs to be in this area if, for example, you're going to sit on search committees, because we need to start having people educated in these areas making the decisions. The other piece is that we have this educational advisory board. I really do recommend people go look at the report, because it is a really great tour de force description of best practices that work. And we've definitely modeled our TIDE group after that group. And one of the things they didn't highlight, but that I've discovered from whatever it is now, 4 or 5 years of TIDE, is when you have a cross-university group that draws from different scholarly fields, you can be fairly bespoke in saying you must have 1 or 2 white men in your entire department or your entire division who are interested in this kind of work. Please send them to us. And we actually have a fair number of white men in our group, including my co-chair, who's a white man, who's an astronomer. You don't see a lot of those people at the EDI table, but he spends as much time as I do immersed in the literature and doing these training sessions. He's always uncomfortable when I highlight him, but I just want to point out there are men doing the work. We just have to find them and then make sure that they get credit where it's due, as do the people of color who are doing this work. Right. So the other thing I'm just going to say quickly, when people of color are doing this work, that means other things come off the table for them. The grunt work has to be, the grunt service work has to come off the table.
That has to happen. If you're going to dedicate a person to do this work, you can't then say, oh, but you can still do everything else that you were doing. I think it's unfair, and it undermines this part, because I've had it happen where it's like you have one title and you have a list of job responsibilities, but then everybody's like, oh, she'd be great for that. And then they give you this too, but they never take away the other things. You still expected, all of your expectations, your job evaluations will be based off of this thing, but this other thing is important also. Which leads me back to what I wanted to say was, in some instances, I think this may not work everywhere, but I think sometimes it really is good to have some tie-in to faculty evaluations, right? it's almost like we have to make it worth the while, right? And unfortunately, it won't work for some people unless it's tied to something else for them. So it's a consideration. But again, if you do it for, if you're going to do it for one, it's got to be you can't just do it for a few. It has to be something that you consider for everyone.
Thank you both for that. Just a follow up to that. So who advocates for that? Is it the person who is being asked to do more of this work in their department or EDI when they have all these other things that count towards tenure? Like who's the person that should advocate for making sure that it's balanced?
So the best advice, one piece of the best advice that I've ever been given, especially in terms of my career, and this is actually when I was a part of academia in a real big sense, was you need to ask for what you want. You need to ask for it. It doesn't mean it'll always be granted to you or for you, but ask for what you want. Okay, you want me to do XYZ 1, 2, 3. Well, that means that this list of responsibilities, 4, 5, 10 things have to be off my plate. If I'm going to devote the time to do the thing that you've asked me to do or I've been asked to do, then I can't be responsible for that. Or, and here's what I normally try to do. So if I'm going to make an ask like that, I'm going to provide them with a general solution so they don't have to think too hard about it. Because, it's immediate. It's one of those things where if you say to them, hey, these 4 things, I don't have time to do them because I'm doing these things. But, this person, this thing, or these things can be distributed along these people to this person. They want to do these. So you provide them with the solution to a problem that they didn't know that they had. So I think that's a good practice. Let me preface, and I guess I should have prefaced all of these things with saying none of this stuff is easy. None of this stuff is easy. We're working in environments that are in the beginning stages of change or in the middle of change. Change is hard. People don't want to do it. And so here we are saying, hey, you got to change everything, not just this one thing. You have to change everything, right? If we're going to do this the way we said we're going to do it, we have to change everything. And some people are going to balk at it. They're going to, no way, everything was good. I don't get what you're talking about. It's trust. I get what I'm asking. But I also believe that if we don't do it, and the collective we, not just Black women, the collective we aren't dedicated to it, then we'll be having the same discussion 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. It'll be the same thing. So when do we really lean in? When do we do that?
Thank you.
Can I just add the call to leadership to that briefly? So again, individuals need to know how to deal with this, and those are all fantastic bits of advice. You can also decide, at this stage in my career, I'm not going to be the EDI fighter in my department. I'm just going to say no to all those roles because I'm a researcher. I am not X, Y, or Z. And I'll tell you the truth. I did that for years. I said, no, I'm not going to be on that EDI task force. I don't want to be pegged as someone who just does EDI. And I've taken that on now that I've been promoted and I feel comfortable doing it. So just younger people, feel free to say, no, you're going to have to find someone else to do that. Just because I have a particular skin color doesn't mean I can sit on that committee. Leadership, we need you to start paying attention when people say these things. And we need you to tell people offline. I mean, I was saved by someone who sat on one of my review committees at my 3rd year review. It wasn't EDI work, but it was a lot of committee work where they were checking a box, I think. And he took me aside and he said, get off half of these committees. I had no way of knowing that I was on twice as many committees as everyone else, right? So it took a white ally telling me that for me to realize I needed to act.
Okay, thank you. We have a few minutes left, so I'm going to try to get through as many questions. So what are some of the things that we can do as individuals to encourage and promote minorities to pursue STEM careers, other than helping our colleagues feel welcome and appreciated? So what are some actionable things?
Outreach programs that specify communities of color. Biggest thing you can do.
Yep. I agree with that 100%. So if they're happening at high school, middle school, elementary school, you have to be there to help elevate that and support it. that's how we feed the pipeline. We have to feed the pipeline, right?
Yes. Again, another question here is, in a mandatory coursework at UBC, it is said that a whistleblower receives negative consequences on their career almost 100% of the time. There are also rules and committees in place to encourage diversity. However, they are made of people in power. What would you say to allies or students experiencing discrimination who are stuck between the fear of consequence and the support of people in committees who would have to speak up against colleagues to support you? Wow, and may not be able to do so.
I'm just going to start by, what is this course and why does it say that? I think that is outrageous for that to be something in a mandatory course that is not balanced. And maybe I'm not hearing the whole story, but anyway, there are challenges, and I think, especially as a junior person, you're almost always better off trying to find someone who you trust, who's more senior to you, who you can have a conversation with, unless you really decide you want to take that on yourself.
I have to, that question hits in a place, because I understand what that feeling is like. And it's not, there's not a one answer to that question. It's so multi-layered that I don't think we have enough time to get into the details of it. But I will say that I do agree with Dr. Andretti. Find someone that you feel that you can trust enough to disclose the information to. If there is some type of student organization or council that you can speak to about it, I would advise you to do that. Someone in leadership must know. They must know, because otherwise it's not going to change. Whoever put the course together and made sure that it was happening, people have got to know. Sometimes all it takes is, I say all, but sometimes it takes someone calling attention to a thing for it to change.
Thank you. And a quick question, maybe not too much, but just that someone is asking about the definition of STEM and feeling like it's excluding nurses and kinesiologists and digital creatives that are Black. And so how do you define STEM, and who fits into this category?
This is good. Okay. This is really good. So STEM for me is the interconnection between science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It's how these four things are interrelated. They have a relationship, and it's the play of all of them together. So I don't feel that doctors, lawyers, whoever the folks were, the health folks, you guys are a part of STEM and a big part of STEM. And so I'm not the individual that would ever say that these groups aren't a part of STEM. You're a major part. Biologists, chemists, physics, doctors, all of you guys, and anyone in between, surgical technicians, the whole like of folks in the medical field, you're STEM.
And I'll just say, we started calling it STEM with 2 M's, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine/health, because we learned that some medicine folks don't see themselves in the STEM label. And I would just say the one difference that you're hearing here is that some of what we're talking about is sort of tenure stream folks or practicing researchers. And so you still could have a STEM education, but your higher degree is not necessarily in STEM research or fundamental STEM. And I think maybe that's a distinction. But again, engineers are practitioners, and they're clearly there too. So we definitely welcome medicine.
Same thing with our the more creative sides of STEM, our graphic designers and so on and so forth. I mean, that's most of that work is technical and you're using a good bit of technology to do it. You guys are STEM. I love the idea of I love the thought and the reality that you guys are in this space. There's been such a huge discussion about adding, we've added an R to STEM for stream and an A. So we have arts and we have reading. And to me, we don't need them because reading is a major part of any STEM field. And art is everything that STEM is about anyway. I mean, it's beautiful. It may not be, as beautiful as we defined beautiful to be, but there's beauty in the processes, there's beauty in the development phase, there's beauty in the end product of it, whether that's medicine or pure science stuff, whether that's you're a statistician or actuary, whether you're in any type of engineering or you're in technology, your code, that's the thing of beauty. That stuff is beautiful to me.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left, but I do want to get to this one question because it's a high school student. And I think, wow, to have a high school student devote their time today to attend this is amazing. And so the question was like, what are some pieces of advice can you share regarding how to navigate these fields, ensuring that I am not overlooked and that my voice will be heard?
All right. So I would tell you first off, keep going. Take advantage of every opportunity that you can to get more experience, to learn more things, and to keep pushing forward. Don't let your voice get lost. You understand what I'm saying? I hope you do. And what I mean is that when you have the opportunity to speak, when you have the opportunity to present, when you have the opportunity to do the thing, then do those things. That's how you learn more. You get opportunities by making sure that you are front and center and present enough, and you're there for them. So that's my advice.
I've actually just popped something in chat. I know that's not usually good form in webinars, but this is the Twitter feed for Chika Stacy Oriwa. She was the only Black person in her year at U of T in the med school. This was several years ago. There's now a program for increasing the number of Black students, partly because of her. She's fantastic. She gave a convocation address. You can listen to it. I think you'll find it inspiring.
Okay, and 2 minutes left. There's a question possibly from a faculty member. Do you have an advice for getting faculty and people in positions of power who are very busy and may not recognize the importance of these efforts to participate in equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, in particular for people who might be very set in their ways and not used to being told what they can and can't do? And I'm thinking in particular of the event Dr. Andrade recounted, where her committee member said, "We have our token woman. Are you happy now?"
It has to come from on high, to be totally honest. I think at UBC, the strat plan suggests that your administration is very serious about it. There has to be reviews that require that people have done professional development in this area. It is no longer something that you can just fake. It is no longer something where you can just read literature on Twitter and know the odd vocabulary word. Our Tri-Council requires that you talk about equity, diversity, inclusion in your granting applications, right? So there are now levers. And I hate to say it, but I think those levers have to come from higher up.
And how do they find the time do they feel like they're so busy?
I think that again, what Dr. Andrade was saying, you have to make the time. It has to be included. So we're doing a faculty professional development, and this one is mandatory for all faculty members, for all staff members, for all whoever. That I think that's the way it has to be until it'll be something that's normalized.
The other thing is that if you have someone at mid-level who's willing to do it, you sandwich it into meetings in which something important is going to be decided. This is the strategy I often give people. You say, we're deciding on new faculty positions in this meeting, and then you sandwich in a 20-minute presentation on EDI.
Oh, I do love that.
Works.
Yep, that would work.
So we have a lot more questions we can't get through, but we are at time. And so I want to thank you both for this exciting conversation. We kind of knew we were going to run out of time because it is such an important topic, and you are both amazing fireballs. And so I've had a great time and learned so much. I wanted to mention to everyone who attended today, we have 5 more sessions in this series. Please go to our website, Where Are the Black People at UBC, and you can see all of the events. Our next session will be focused on medicine and community health. And we have some amazing speakers lined up for that. And that's on April 26th. So please go to our website, register for the event. The event link is now in the chat where you can go and make sure that you are a part of all the series. Again, just to mention, every person has to register because each link is unique to your email. And so that way, if you want to share and invite someone else, just send them the link to register themselves. So thank you so much. Please tweet, share this event. Thank you, Mady, and thank you, Dr. Tasha. I have a lot of questions here. I'll try to forward them to you. And if you have any time, it would be really great if you can just give some feedback to some of the questions we weren't able to answer today. And I also want to thank our committee members. We're kind of a hodgepodge of teams that got together to make this series happen, especially to Asmin, who's been really great, and Paul, and to all the great faculty and staff who's a part of this team to make this speaker series available to you. I appreciate all of you, and thank you so much for your time today.